Welcome to the debate. This exchange focuses directly on concepts that came up in the Neon Core Media show, The Deep Dive, specifically the episode on near-death experiences, or NDEs. The material presented there, it really challenges the most fundamental and, deeply entrenched assumption of contemporary science, that consciousness is solely an emergent property of the physical brain.
And that challenge isn't just philosophical, it's medical. We are, I think, grappling with a profound contradiction here. The fact that people are reporting hyperlucid, organized consciousness, when according to the standard materialist model, the biological machinery that's supposed to be generating that consciousness has effectively reached a clinical shutdown.
Exactly. So the central question for us today is really this. Does the sheer volume and frankly, the compelling nature of the evidence from NDEs, especially when you view it through the lens of these ancient non-materialist frameworks, does it compel us to abandon the view that consciousness is just generated by the brain in favor of this radical countersystem that consciousness is non-local and merely received by the brain?
And I'll be arguing that while the NDE data is, I agree, profoundly significant, and it absolutely forces us to reconsider the limits of the materialist view, the current interpretation remains insufficient to just discard it entirely. I want to focus on the severe limitations surrounding verification and the critical conceptual pitfalls that are inherent in that non-local receiver model.
And I will be arguing that the data necessitates the non-local consciousness model. I mean, the evidence from millions of NDE reports directly contradicts what you would expect, that consciousness should be chaotic, fragmented, or, non-existent when the brain reaches clinical death. We're talking about a lack of measurable electrical activity and starvation of oxygen.
Right. You're talking about lucidity, coherence, and an expansion of awareness happening when the light should, for all intents and purposes, be off. That internal testimony it's undeniable.
Precisely. You just have to look at the well-documented accounts like Anita Moorjani, who was in a coma with end-stage cancer. She described fluting above her body, watching doctors work, having 360-degree peripheral vision of the entire room, and describing conversations and procedures with just astonishing clarity. That kind of supernormal lucidity happening while the brain is clinically compromised, it pushes the phenomenon far beyond what we can just rationalize away as the last gasp of a dying brain. It's too organized, it's too rich, and it's too often shared.
Well, I come at it from a slightly different angle. We absolutely have to submit these NDE reports, as significant as they are, to the necessary critique. The whole idea that they prove non-local consciousness, it really relies very heavily on anecdotal and, let's be honest, sensational reports, particularly those veridical details. The patient seeing the shoe on the ledge, or the surgeon flapping his arms.
So you're focusing on the verification process of those specific observational details.
Yes, because the robustness of that verification is genuinely questionable, particularly when it comes to the critical timestamp. It is notoriously difficult to confirm the exact micro-moment that a description was made relative to the moment of true, sustained clinical brain death, that point of zero electrical activity. And this leaves a crucial window of ambiguity, where some residual, albeit compromised, brain function might still account for the experience.
I see the value in that kind of intellectual rigor, but I'm not convinced that the difficulty in, affixing a precise timestamp just invalidates the collective data. The data points don't just disappear because verification is challenging. The scientifically significant fact remains the sheer volume and consistency of these highly lucid, organized reports when the machine that supposedly generates observation is turned off. If we dismiss that, I think we'd commit an even greater scientific contradiction.
But volume doesn't equal scientific control. Let me just push back on the shift you're making here. You're moving from the observed, empirical contradiction, this lucid brain at clinical zero, to a whole metaphysical framework claiming the data necessitates a non-local explanation. I'd suggest that this shift often caters to a deeper psychological yearning.
How so?
The philosophical jump you're advocating for, abandoning the idea of the skin-encapsulated ego, which is that linear physical sense of self, is very often rooted in our intrinsic human resistance to impermanence, what's known in Eastern philosophy as anusia, This resistance, this struggle against flux and change, that is what breeds chronic dissatisfaction, or dukkha.
I'm not really convinced by that line of reasoning because it feels like you're trying to reduce a profound physiological mystery to just psychological motivation. The fact that the experience is transcendent and causes psychological relief is, to me, evidence of its nature, not its invalidation.
But the two are interconnected. Look, adopting complex, untestable metaphysical systems like the Hindu concept of Leela, life as a cosmic drama, or Hermetic mentalism, the idea that the universe is mental, it risks confusing the map for the territory. Our linear notation systems, limited as they are essential for scientific scrutiny, and we have to be careful not to mistake a psychological secret, the disappearance of fear, for physical proof of an independent non-local consciousness.
Okay, let's focus on the theoretical mechanism then, because the consistency of the NDE experience demands a robust explanation that materialism just fails to provide. The simplest solution is the brain as tuner metaphor. If the brain is merely a receiver, then the signal of consciousness remains perfect even when the physical receiver is damaged. Like if the TV gets smashed, the broadcast signal itself remains intact.
The metaphor is powerful, I'll give you that, but it's far too simplistic for explaining neurobiology. The materialist view holds that the brain is the broadcast, it's the source, not the antenna. And furthermore, the jump to non-local consciousness relies so heavily on overcoming the anxiety of the isolated self, which Alan Watts described as the consequence of our linear scanning systems, our language and science forcing us into this feeling of being separate.
But the metaphor aligns perfectly with the Hermetic principle of mentalism. The universe is fundamentally mental and exists within the mind of the all. And this framework is crucial because it doesn't just explain NDE lucidity, it suggests a universal operating system. If thought is the fundamental cause substance, as these traditions suggest, then the brain's function is simply to filter that universal thought and localize it. Well, it explains why a focus system like Neville Goddard's method of using a set suppressing the rational, critical faculty could potentially mold external reality by aligning localized thought with that fundamental universal consciousness. The NDE state, where the critical faculty and linear brain activity are suppressed by clinical death, it achieves this alignment involuntarily, and that results in the experience of unity and creation. It offers a singular theoretical framework for both NDEs and these esoteric practices that are rooted in mind over matter.
That is a compelling synthesis, but I would frame it very differently. I would suggest the unity experienced in the NDE is the direct, necessary result of the cessation of that psychological resistance. The anxiety, the dukkha, is the result of resisting impermanence, anitya. So when the brain, which acts as the filtering mechanism creating the illusion of separateness, shuts down, the individual just stops struggling to make flux permanent.
So you agree the brain is a filtering mechanism?
I agree that the brain and our intellectual tools, specifically language, they impose a linear scan on reality which convinces us we are separate entities. The NDE experience, by dissolving that intellectual boundary, leads to the feeling of profound unity. But that is still a very important distinction. Psychological liberation and the dissolution of the illusion of self is not the same thing as empirical proof that the brain is receiving an external, permanent broadcast signal.
But if the experience of unity consistently occurs when the mechanism of separation, the physical brain struggling with the anxiety of existence, shuts down, that strongly reinforces the idea that unity is the default state, that it's the broadcast signal, and the brain is the filter that creates the illusion of separateness. Let's look at the consequences of these worldviews. The deep dive material itself explores how our cultural models shape our interpretation of reality, specifically this tension between the Western monarchy model and more organic models like Leela or Taoism. The monarchy model, which views God or ultimate reality as some kind of external boss, leads directly to deep social distrust and a fear of chaos.
Right. The fear that without the king, the external authority, society will immediately riot.
Exactly. And that fear is why abandoning the self, Zen's spontaneous action, Wutsu law, is often seen as socially dangerous in the West. We fear that without external top-down control, we will devolve into chaotic behavior. That's a reasonable social and political fear, rooted entirely in this cultural model of external authority. If we adopt a new metaphysical model, we have to address this consequence. We have to accept what Confucius called irreducible rascally, the inherent necessary flaw in human nature, rather than pursue some impossible angelic perfection derived from a sudden unity experience.
I would actually counter that the monarchy model is precisely the source of contemporary anxiety. It's the dukkha engine running on external, distrusted authority. The irony of the institutional response to deep spiritual wisdom proves this point historically. When figures like Jesus realized and taught the principle, I and the Father are one, a statement of universal, non-local, eternal self-awareness, the institutional response was to immediately make him a unique historical exception, which nullified that universal possibility for the masses and restored external authority.
That's a powerful critique of the impulse toward institutionalization. I'll grant you that. But institution is a social necessity, and often the price of social cohesion is the suppression of radical individual realization.
But the models of Leela, pure, unscripted drama, and Taoism, with its concept of Tsujan, or spontaneity, they offer a profound alternative. They suggest a path where the individual realizes they are inherently a waving of the whole cosmos. This is precisely what the NDE patient experiences when fear dissipates. The NDE shows us that the problem is the resistance to the flow of reality, not the flow itself. The Tao doesn't require external monarchical control to be orderly. It is a self-organizing, organic system. The NDE is simply the individual briefly accessing that organic state.
I agree that embracing spontaneity and the flow of nature is profound wisdom, but we must remain intellectually cautious and avoid confusing that wisdom with empirical proof. The acceptance of Maya, the world as a perfectly good illusion, a masterful work of art by Brahman, is a potent spiritual teaching that releases the individual from struggle. However, accepting the illusion as a work of art does not constitute evidence that the brain is receiving a signal from a non-local broadcast tower. It's a psychological state achieved when the brain stops filtering, not necessarily a physical discovery about the fundamental structure of consciousness outside the body.
In sum, the consistency and depth of NDE lucidity, particularly the psychological relief that occurs when the skin-encapsulated ego dissolves, strongly points toward consciousness being a pervasive non-local force. When the mind realizes, I and the Father are one, the anxiety dissipates because the individual recognizes their true self isn't separate but is the total energy of the world. The wisdom of traditions like Hermeticism, then, provides the operating manual for a reality where the universe is mental, suggesting the highest spiritual realization is democratically available to all, a universal, constant broadcast.
Yet, the intellectual imperative requires us to be rigorously cautious of untestable metaphysical assumptions, regardless of how comforting or consistent they might be. While the NDE phenomena absolutely challenges the fundamental limitations of the current scientific narrative on brain death, the ambiguity surrounding the precise timing of observation relative to clinical death means we have to avoid mistaking the map, a linear intellectual scan of reality, for the territory. The philosophical goal of acceptance, of going with the flow, should not be mistaken for definitive physical evidence of an external, permanent broadcast signal.
I think we both agree that the ultimate mystery of what happens when we reach clinical zero continues to force a profound reconsideration of the fundamental relationship between the mind and the body. It pushes us well beyond simplistic materialist explanations. The sheer audacity of the NDE data demands a more comprehensive model of reality.
Indeed. The synthesis presented by The Deep Dive regarding these unseen narratives forces us all to confront uncomfortable truths about our own nature and the limitations of our conventional understanding. The tension between verifiable data and profound experience is, well, that's where the real exploration lies, and there is certainly much more to explore in this material.